A medieval blacksmith could forge a sword that would lie in a swamp for 100 years and come out almost as sharp as on the day it was made. But your modern car starts to rust after the first winter. A paradox? Only if you look at history superficially. We are used to thinking that the technologies of the past were primitive, crude, and imperfect, and that modern metallurgy is the pinnacle of progress. But what if I told you that ancient craftsmen knew things about iron that we have not simply forgotten, but consciously refused to apply? That they did not work according to Gauss standards, but according to a living science passed down from teacher to student, where every spark, every blow of the hammer changed the properties of the metal to a degree that is considered irrational today? In a world where a single scratch could be fatal, dirty iron saturated with impurities became real armor. And where modern alloy steels are affected by rust, ancient blades survived centuries in swamps, salt water, and even in the ground, because they were created not for standards, but for eternity. Watch the video to the end to find out how impurities in metal save lives, why rust is a planned inevitability today, and what forgotten technology could make any modern car virtually invulnerable. What if I told you that everything you believed about the primitiveness of ancient technologies is not true? We are used to thinking of metal as a dead, cold material that comes off the assembly line in identical soulless sheets. However, for people in the Middle Ages, iron was something completely different. A capricious, living material that was born in the throes of fire and earth, demanding special treatment and respect. The process of obtaining iron in those days was more like a magical ritual or the preparation of a complex dish than industrial production. The ore was not mined with huge excavators, but by hand, collecting the so-called swamp ore, red lumps literally saturated with organic matter from peat bogs. This ore already contained natural impurities, which, oddly enough, played a key role in the future durability of the metal. In raw air furnaces made of clay and stones, the temperature never reached the point at which iron becomes liquid like water. The metal remained in a solid, dough-like state, forming a spongy mass saturated with slag, a glassy substance that modern metallurgists consider harmful waste. But it was this waste that became the first barrier to corrosion. When forging this spongy bloom, the blacksmith did not simply shape it, but mechanically knocked out the excess slag, leaving the finest threads of glass inside the metal structure. These microscopic fibers acted as reinforcement in concrete and as insulation, preventing rust from spreading deep into the product. Unlike modern homogeneous rolled steel, medieval iron was layered, similar to wood or puff pastry. If corrosion did begin, it spread across the surface, but encountered barriers of slag and stopped, unable to penetrate the core of the blade or nail. Today we strive for chemical purity in steel, removing everything unnecessary from it, and thereby making it vulnerable to oxygen and moisture. Medieval metal was dirty by our standards, but it was this dirt that made it virtually immortal in conditions of constant dampness and lack of lubricants. Each hand-forged item underwent thousands of hammer blows, which compacted the outer layers, creating a natural hardened crust. This was not chemical treatment, but a physical change in the structure of the material at the molecular level, accessible only to a master who could feel the metal with his fingertips. We have replaced quality with quantity, creating millions of tons of steel that requires constant protection with paints and primers. Medieval man could not afford such luxuries, so he created things that were meant to last not for years, but for centuries, passed down from father to son. The paradox is that, with microscopes and laboratories, we create disposable items, while a blacksmith with a hammer and anvil created eternity. Perhaps progress has not followed the path of improving quality, but rather that of reducing the cost of the process, forcing us to pay for it by constantly replacing things. I am very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the fact that the dirty technologies of the past turned out to be more reliable than modern ones? Write about it in the comments. Want to know a secret that will change your life and your understanding of chemistry? In modern metallurgy, phosphorus is considered a harmful impurity that makes steel brittle in the cold, causing it to break like glass. However, in the Middle Ages, when no one had heard of Mendeleev's periodic table, this element played a completely different, life-saving role in the survival of products. The bogore we talked about earlier was rich in phosphorus thanks to decomposing plants and the remains of organisms in the bogs. When smelted in low-temperature furnaces, this phosphorus did not burn out, but remained in the structure of the iron, forming a unique chemical alloy. This high phosphorus metal had an amazing property. A dense oxide film formed on its surface that did not flake off like ordinary red rust. This film worked like modern bluing or passivation, completely blocking oxygen from reaching the deeper layers of the metal. In fact, medieval iron preserved itself, covering itself with a noble dark patina that not only did not destroy the object, but also protected it from further decay. Archaeologists often find knives and arrowheads that look as if they were lost yesterday, even though they have been lying in the ground for hundreds of years. Of course, there was a downside to this. Such iron was more difficult to forge and could crack when struck hard on a frosty day. But for everyday items, nails, staples, door hinges, agricultural tools, corrosion resistance was more important than ultimate impact strength. Ancient craftsmen learned empirically to distinguish between grades of iron, even without knowing their chemical composition. They used phosphorus iron where hardness and rust resistance were needed, and softer iron where flexibility was required. The famous iron pillar in Delhi, which has not rusted for 1,500 years, is not magic or alien technology. It is the result of precisely this high phosphorus content and a special forging process that created a protective barrier that modern science has only recently been able to explain. We spend billions on anti-corrosion coatings, galvanizing and painting in an attempt to protect perfectly clean steel. Ancient blacksmiths simply used what nature gave them, turning the material's weakness into its main advantage. This teaches us that in the struggle for survival, it is not always necessary to fight against the nature of the material. Sometimes you need to understand its hidden properties and use them, even if they seem like flaws at first glance. How long do you think it took ancient craftsmen to understand the properties of phosphorus without chemistry textbooks? What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries concerned with the environment. But it was this fuel that was the foundation on which entire civilizations grew. We are used to the idea that metal is born in the fire of coal, that modern metallurgy is impossible without coke, that high temperatures are inevitably accompanied by acrid smoke and heavy emissions. But the medieval world smelled different. It smelled of burnt wood, quietly smoldering coals, resinous fumes, and hot ash. Because the only fuel capable of giving iron life was charcoal. Charcoal is not just burnt wood. It is an amazingly clean, noble fuel, almost completely free of sulfur and other impurities that today destroy metal before it even leaves the blast furnace. When ore billets were cooked in medieval furnaces, surrounded by charcoal on all sides, they were saturated with pure natural carbon. Not sulfide inclusions, not toxic slag, but the very carbon that turned cold metal into steel. As a result, the metal was not only strong, it was long-lasting and resistant to destruction, as if an invisible shield were hidden in its structure. The distribution of carbon was uneven. In one place, the steel became elastic, in another, viscous, in a third, hard. But the main thing was the absence of sulfur. There were no microscopic, hellish points from which ulcerative corrosion begins, slowly and imperceptibly eating away at the metal from the inside. Medieval craftsmen did not know chemistry, did not know how to analyze microstructure, but they knew the result. Metal forged in pure fire lasted for centuries. The production of charcoal was a huge undertaking. Charcoal burners lived in the forest for months, almost like monks. But instead of praying, they read the smoke. They built huge earthen piles, mills as they were called in Europe, and watched over them day and night. Inside, the piles smoldered slowly without access to air. A single gust of wind or a minor mistake was enough to turn everything to ash, depriving blacksmiths of fuel for many months. It was dangerous, exhausting, and dirty work. But it was this work that provided civilization with the metal that held swords, plows, stirrups, chainmail, locks, and bridges together. Today, it is impossible to imagine industrial charcoal production on the same scale as before. To do so would require cutting down half the planet. The transition to coal and coke made metal cheap and accessible, but at the same time killed its health. We began to produce metal quickly, in large quantities and efficiently. But our metal has a lifespan that is dozens of times shorter. We have created a civilization built on steel that ages, rusts, deforms, and requires constant repair. A medieval sword forged with charcoal had a completely different internal structure. Its crystal lattice was denser, more stable, and more evenly distributed. It was not perfectly hard, but it was much more durable. It did not crumble, fall apart, or rust as quickly. Even a plow made in a village would last for decades, and when it broke, the blacksmith would forge a new blade or cover plate, and the tool would work again. Charcoal ash was also put to good use. It was used as a flux, as protection against oxidation, and as a coating in which to wrap the red-hot workpiece. The alkaline environment created by the ash passivated the metal directly during forging. Each blow of the hammer not only shaped the metal, but also strengthened its structure, sealing the pores and protecting the surface. We consider the transition to fossil fuels to be progress. We are proud of our speed, volume, and productivity. But if we look at the quality of the metal, we see not a step forward, but a step backward. We have gained in quantity, but lost in essence. We have created a civilization of bridges, wires, machines, and tools that are pre-programmed to die, to corrode, fatigue, and break down. Our ancestors created less, but they created for eternity. If you are amazed that ancient craftsmen, without laboratories or metal theory, created steel that surpasses modern steel in durability, don't forget to like this video. History often shows that the simplest solutions are stronger than the most complex technologies, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. What if everything you've been taught about Damascus steel is just the tip of the iceberg? We often hear about legendary Japanese katanas or Damascus blades, but the principle of multi-layering was used everywhere, even for the manufacture of simple knives and tools. It was not an aesthetic whim, but a harsh necessity for survival in a world of scarce and heterogeneous raw materials. The blacksmith took a piece of iron, flattened it, folded it in half, welded it with hammer blows, and repeated this process dozens of times. The result was a material consisting of hundreds or even thousands of the thinnest layers, tightly welded together, but retaining their boundaries. This structure worked like plywood. If a crack or rust appeared in one layer, it could not simply pass into the next. It had to overcome the barriers between the layers and change direction, which slowed down the destruction process hundreds of times over. Modern rolled metal is isotropic. It is the same in all directions, and if corrosion finds a loophole, it eats through the sheet along the shortest path. In layered medieval iron, the path of corrosion turned into a complex labyrinth, which was practically impossible to pass through in a human lifetime. In addition, the forging process averaged out the properties of the metal. If there was a defect or harmful impurity in one place, it was spread in a thin layer throughout the entire volume, ceasing to be a critical point of destruction. This is reminiscent of the principle behind the creation of modern composite materials used in aviation and space. It turns out that medieval blacksmiths were the first creators of composites, using hammers and anvils instead of autoclaves and polymers. Each layer also had a slightly different chemical composition due to the burning of carbon on the surface with each heating. This created an electrochemical potential difference between the layers, which sometimes paradoxically protected the metal, causing only individual micro areas to corrode, but preserving the integrity of the product. This technique required enormous time and physical effort. It could take several days of work to make a simple knife, but that knife would serve 3 generations of hunters without breaking or rotting in its sheath. Today we stamp out millions of knives per hour, but they lose their sharpness in the air and become stained by lemon juice. We have accelerated production time, but stolen the life of the objects themselves. Do you think modern metallurgists could return to such labor-intensive processes for the sake of quality? In a world without auto chemical stores and WD-40 spray cans, people had to look for ways to protect metal in the surrounding nature. People back then couldn't just buy a ready-made product, so they carefully observed how different natural materials behaved. They tried grease, resin, wax, and oils to understand what best kept metal dry and clean. This search was not just curiosity, but a necessity, because a lot depended on the preservation of iron. And oddly enough, the products they found often turned out to be more effective and safer than modern synthetics. Survival depended on how well you took care of your equipment. If a person went on a hike, hunting, or to war, they knew that metal could fail at any moment if it was not properly cared for. In humid climates or in constant contact with the ground, rust would appear literally overnight. Therefore, the habit of regularly wiping down a blade or axe was not a ritual, but part of everyday discipline. Keeping iron in good condition could save lives, and everyone understood this, from simple peasants to experienced warriors. The most common preservative was animal fat, goose, bear, or pork. It was easy to obtain, could be stored for a long time, and was available in almost every home. When the fat was applied to hot metal, it began to melt and spread, filling the smallest irregularities. Medieval iron was very porous, and the fat really penetrated deep into the surface. After cooling, it turned into a dense layer that reliably repelled moisture. The polymerized fat created a durable water-repellent film that lasted for months. It not only protected the metal from rust, but also made it easier to clean later. Many craftsmen applied the fat immediately after forging so that the metal had time to absorb it at the most important moment. Sometimes the layer was reinforced by repeating the procedure several times. This simple technology was widely known and considered one of the most reliable. Beeswax mixed with turpentine or oil was also used. This composition was especially popular with craftsmen who valued the combination of protection and a pleasant appearance. The wax gave the metal a slight shine and a pleasant smell. It was applied warm so that it spread more easily over the surface and filled in any unevenness. The mixture was thick but quickly hardened, forming an elastic layer. This mixture did not simply cover the surface, but literally absorbed into the structure of the top layer. The metal became smooth but slightly greasy to the touch, which did not interfere at all because it was this film that made it resistant to moisture. Weapons treated with wax were not afraid of rain or blood. The wax was easy to renew. It was enough to melt it slightly and reapply it. So many people used it for years. Bluing or blackening was not a decorative technique. It originated as a way to improve the practical qualities of iron. To do this, the metal was heated and immersed in oil or sprinkled with scale to create a thin protective layer. This process required precision and knowledge, so it was often performed by experienced craftsmen. The result was a characteristic dark color, which today is considered an aesthetic element. But at that time, it had primarily practical value. Heating the metal in oil or treating it with scale created a layer of magnetite, a stable black iron oxide. It is chemically passive, so it prevents red rust from developing.
Blackened layer.
This layer was dense, hard, and weather-resistant. Blacksmithing weapons lasted longer without corroding, even in humid climates. It is thanks to magnetite that many archaeological finds have been so well preserved. People in the Middle Ages treated their weapons and tools as partners in survival. They understood that the quality of a steel object depended not only on the craftsman, but also on how it was held in the hands. Every evening, knights and soldiers would check the condition of their blades, inspect their armor, and remove traces of dirt and moisture. This was as much a part of military life as training or praying before battle. Knights wiped their swords and armor with oiled rags, not because it was written in the rules, but because their lives in tomorrow's battle depended on the condition of their iron.
Keep the edge oiled, lad.
Everyone understood that dull, rusty, or weakened metal could fail at the most crucial moment. Therefore, caring for iron was a matter of honor. Warriors passed on advice to each other, formed habits, and created their own maintenance methods. Rust was perceived as a disease of metal that needed to be treated immediately. It was considered the first sign that an object was beginning to deteriorate. The slightest spot could turn into a deep ulcer if not removed in time. Therefore, people carefully monitored the condition of the surface and tried to prevent corrosion. It was daily work, but it provided reliability, which was valued above all else. Any spot was rubbed with sand, polished with leather, and covered with grease again. To do this, they used whatever was at hand: river sand, soft leather, pieces of cloth. Such mechanical care gradually made the surface smooth and shiny. Over time, the metal became less susceptible to moisture because the micro cracks disappeared. This constant work turned even rough items into reliable and durable objects. In everyday life, cast iron pots and pans were seasoned with linseed oil. This was a traditional way to make cookware durable and easy to use. When the oil burned out, it left a thin layer of carbon film that prevented food from sticking. This layer became denser with each use. For centuries, housewives passed such pots down from generation to generation because their quality only improved over time. This created the very non-stick coating that we now call Teflon, only it was natural and completely renewable. If the layer was damaged, the cookware was simply reseasoned. This made kitchen utensils almost eternal. Cast iron was valued for its ability to distribute heat evenly, and the protective oil layer for its durability. This method was known not only in Europe, but also in different cultures around the world. Wooden sheaths and handles were also impregnated with oils to prevent the wood from absorbing moisture from the air. If the handle got wet, it could swell, crack, or loosen its attachment. Oil impregnation made the wood dense, smooth, and pleasant to the touch. In addition to protection, it improved the appearance of the products and helped to extend their service life. Craftsmen often used linseed, walnut, or hemp oil, depending on the region. Are you ready for the shocking truth about why old things seem so heavy? We live in an age of optimization and material savings, where engineers calculate the strength of a structure with the minimum possible margin to save every gram and every cent. In the Middle Ages, the logic was exactly the opposite. No expense was spared on materials because reliability was valued above economy. Medieval products, whether gate hinges, bolts, tools, or armor components, were significantly more massive than their modern counterparts. This excess thickness served as a simple but effective corrosion allowance. Even if the metal began to rust, it had a huge reserve of body. Rust could eat away a millimeter per decade, but if a part was a centimeter thick, it would continue to function for another 100 years without losing critical strength. Modern sheet metal with a thickness of 0.5 millimeter used in the automotive industry will rust through at the first deep scratch. It simply does not have a margin of strength, no time to resist an aggressive environment. The massiveness of medieval objects also provided better heat capacity and resistance to thermal deformation. Thick metal heated up more slowly and cooled down more slowly, which reduced the formation of condensation, the main culprit of hidden corrosion. Blacksmiths intuitively understood that the thinner the product, the faster it would return to the ground in the form of rusty dust. Therefore, critical components were made with a multiple margin of strength, which today would be considered a waste of metal. This coarseness and heaviness of medieval iron, which we often perceive as a sign of primitive technology, was in fact a deliberate strategy for durability. The item had to outlive its creator. In addition, the thick layer of metal allowed for multiple reforging and repairs. If the blade of an axe was worn down or chipped, it could be sharpened again, as there was plenty of meat in the tang. Today's items are often beyond repair. The walls are too thin to be welded, and the metal is too weak to be straightened. The disposable economy dictates the creation of disposable items. In the next chapter, you will learn how the environment we consider clean actually kills metal faster than any acid. We often complain about poor ecology, but rarely think about how it affects the metal around us. We talk about health hazards, poor well-being, and the burden on nature, but we almost never think about what happens to the simple things in our daily lives. Meanwhile, iron, which has surrounded people for centuries, reacts to air and moisture much faster than we can imagine. It becomes a kind of indicator of the state of the environment. Its destruction shows how much the world has changed and how much we have influenced it. Despite the smoke from hearths and the stench of city streets, the air of the Middle Ages was chemically completely different from the air of a modern metropolis. The cities of that time may have been dirty in terms of smell, but the chemical load on the atmosphere remained minimal. The smoke that rose from the furnaces contained soot and carbon dioxide, but almost no serious aggressive compounds. People lived among natural sources of pollution, not industrial products. This created an environment that was gentler on metal. The medieval air lacked the main metal killers, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. These substances simply could not be produced in significant quantities because there were no large industrial furnaces and factories operating around the clock. They were not produced by the thousands of cars we see on the streets today. Therefore, in those days, metal reacted mainly with ordinary moisture and oxygen. This was not enough to quickly destroy iron. These harmful compounds are the product of burning millions of tons of coal, oil, and gas, as well as car exhaust. Every major city emits these substances into the atmosphere every day, forming a constant chemical background. Factories and power plants add their emissions to this, increasing the impact on the environment. Together, they create a mixture that gradually makes the air aggressive to metal. We breathe the same air as our cars and bridges. When combined with moisture in the air, these substances form weak solutions of sulfuric and nitric acids. This turns an ordinary raindrop into an agent capable of accelerating corrosion in a matter of hours. Such rain does not look dangerous. It seems as transparent and harmless as ordinary water. But chemical reactions start instantly. We may not even feel the difference, but metal feels it very quickly. We literally live in an atmosphere of acid rain, even if we don't notice it. Precipitation, fog, humid air, all of these carry dissolved moisture and gases that react with the surface of metal. Experts note that in areas with heavy traffic, corrosion occurs faster, even in new structures. People have become accustomed to gray skies and smog without thinking that this is not just a nuisance. It is a factor that affects things we consider reliable and durable. For medieval iron, rain was just water. It could leave stains, but it did not corrode the metal so actively that it would deteriorate in a few weeks. Iron was covered with a thin layer of oxide, which even served as protection. Craftsmen knew how to care for such surfaces, and it was part of their daily routine. They did not encounter the aggressive acids that are everywhere today. For modern iron, rain is an electrolyte that instantly triggers electrochemical corrosion. It can penetrate microcracks and damage, rapidly destroying the surface. When steel gets wet in the rain, it actually comes into contact with a diluted acid solution. This explains why modern structures require constant monitoring. Even high-quality alloys succumb to this effect faster than one might expect. This is why metal corrodes much faster in industrial areas than in rural areas. In remote villages, the air is cleaner, and the humidity does not contain large amounts of aggressive compounds. There, metal ages naturally rather than under the influence of chemical acids. Many people notice that old village gates or tools can last for decades. In the city, however, similar items begin to deteriorate after just a few seasons. In addition, thousands of tons of reagents and salts are spread on our roads in winter. These substances are necessary for safety, but they come at a price. When mixed with water and snow, salts form aggressive solutions that easily react with metal. They stick to wheels, car bodies, and metal structures on the street. This effect continues even after drying. This salt mist, thrown up by cars, penetrates the smallest cracks, creating ideal conditions for instant rusting. It settles on bridges, fences, road barriers, and any metal surfaces. Even new parts can start to rust in just one winter. In such conditions, protecting metal becomes a constant struggle. Medieval iron, which was not exposed to such reagents, was not subject to this level of destruction. Medieval iron did not experience such aggressive attacks. It only encountered moisture, dirt, and mild natural acids that appeared during the decay of plants. This was a completely different impact, mild and slow. Craftsmen could rely on natural processes and their own knowledge. Therefore, their iron products could be preserved for centuries without catastrophic wear and tear. Even in coastal areas where sea salt has always been a problem, ancient iron held up better thanks to its dense oxide crust and slag inclusions. Slag in the structure of early iron often acted as a natural protection, closing pores and preventing moisture penetration. Salty air could cause damage, but not as quickly as it does today. That is why many artifacts found near the sea look surprisingly intact. Their properties are explained by technology, not luck. There is another factor that historians and metallurgists often forget, the so-called survivor bias. When we look at museum display cases containing perfectly preserved swords and helmets, we do not see the millions of tons of iron that have rotted away without a trace and turned into red dust. Only the best examples have survived. Those that were made by the most talented craftsmen from the best ore and which were stored in ideal conditions. We judge the entire metallurgy of the era by its best representatives, ignoring mass defects and low-quality crafts. There was also a lot of bad iron in the Middle Ages. Peasant tools, cheap knives, and consumables were often made haphazardly and did not last long, but they disappeared, dissolved in time. Only masterpieces and items that found themselves in unique preservation conditions remained, for example, in the oxygen-free layers of peat bogs. Nevertheless, even average quality metal was more durable than modern consumer goods, for reasons described in the first chapters. But we should not idealize the past and think that every village blacksmith was a magician. The process of natural selection worked here too. Successful technology was consolidated and passed on, while unsuccessful technology died with the craftsman. In the absence of standards and GOSTs, the craftsman's name and generations of experience were a guarantee of quality. The items that survived were often expensive and prestigious. They were cared for, cherished, and passed down from generation to generation. A sword could cost as much as an entire village, and it was treated accordingly. No one left it out in the rain to rust. We, on the other hand, treat things as consumer goods. We don't take care of them because it's easier to buy new ones. This mental shift also affects the survivability of iron. If an item is not valued, it dies faster. Thus, the phenomenon of stainless medieval iron is a combination of unique technologies, chemical composition, and careful selection over time. It is a puzzle in which all the pieces fit together. We see the elite of the metal world of the past and compare it to the masses of the present. It's not an entirely fair comparison, but it still opens our eyes to the fact that we have lost our understanding of the value of the material. It is not the strongest metal that survives, but the one that was made with soul and stored with love. In the Middle Ages, iron was a strategic resource, a currency, and a real treasure. It was so highly valued that even a small metal object could play a huge role in the economy. It was never thrown away, because the very idea of throwing away metal seemed crazy. Even if an item broke, it was collected as carefully as precious jewelry. The concept of a scrap metal dump simply did not exist, because throwing away iron was tantamount to losing wealth. People could not afford the luxury of leaving old scraps unused. Anything that could be melted down or reforged was gradually returned to the forge. The blacksmith was the one who gave metal a new life, turning it into tools or weapons again and again. This was how the whole society functioned, and it was considered natural. Every broken horseshoe, every bent nail, every piece of a broken knife was carefully collected and taken back to the blacksmith. This constant reworking of old metal also affected its properties. The metal was heated again and again, removing impurities and improving its structure. Each cycle made it stronger, denser, and more reliable, as the slag gradually came out. This purification was slow but natural. As a result, old metal became especially valuable. The metal went through many cycles of heating and forging, which further purified it and compacted its structure. These processes were well known to blacksmiths, although they explained them in their own folk terms. The craftsmen saw that old iron performed better in their work and tried not to waste a single piece. Gradually, the understanding developed that the age of metal was its advantage. Thus, old iron acquired a special status. Old iron was valued even more highly than new iron because it had already been tested in practice. It had been used in tools, withstood heavy loads, and proven to be reliable. People knew that if metal had not cracked over years of service, it would continue to serve. Therefore, old metal was often used for important items. It was considered the best material for blades and tools. Today, metal recycling involves smelting in giant furnaces where everything is mixed together. Different types of metal lose their characteristics, turning into a single material. The history of each object disappears in huge melting pots. We get new steel, but we lose the memory of what the old metal was like. This is a different approach based on scale and speed. In such furnaces, the metal is diluted with fresh ore and alloying additives. It ceases to be the result of many years of processing and becomes a mass product. This simplifies production but makes the metal impersonal. Each piece loses its uniqueness, dissolving into the general mass. This is convenient for industry, but irreplaceable for history. We lose the history of metal by turning it into an impersonal mass. We do not know how long a particular piece of iron has served, what trials it has gone through. Modern production does not take into account the past of the material. It looks only to the future of the product, forgetting that metal used to carry the memory of generations. Thus, the connection between objects and their owners disappears. For a medieval person, losing an iron tool was a tragedy that threatened the survival of the family. One broken axe could ruin the supply of firewood for the winter. One lost hoe could deprive them of their harvest. Metal was part of everyday work, so it was valued more than many other things. Losing a tool meant losing time and energy. This made people treat these items with religious reverence. They stored their tools in dry places, checked their condition, and protected them from damage. They understood that making a new item could take a long time and be costly. Therefore, they valued these things as we value expensive devices today. Iron was almost sacred. No one would leave a plow in the field for the winter. This was considered not just a mistake, but a real crime against one's own labor. The economic factor worked stronger than any chemical protection. Iron did not rust, not because it was better, but because it was cared for every day. It was not left in the rain, thrown in the dirt, or kept in the open air. People knew how to take care of their belongings because life demanded it. Even the most modest items were preserved in this way. We have come to the main question. Can we make the same eternal iron today? Technically, yes. We can recreate the raw iron process, use the purest coal, and forge multi-layer packages by hand, but it will cost a fortune. Modern industry has focused on technology, speed, and low cost. We have consciously sacrificed durability in favor of affordability. It is our civilization's choice to have many items of average quality instead of one eternal item. Planned obsolescence is not a conspiracy theory, but the basis of the modern economy. It is not profitable for a manufacturer if you drive the same car for 50 years. They want it to fall apart in 5 to 7 years so that you come back for a new one. Medieval blacksmiths worked according to a different business model. If their axe broke or rusted, no one would come to them anymore. Their reputation was the key to the survival of their family. We traded individual craftsmanship for standardization. We gained comfort and access to technology, but lost the soul of things. Knowledge has not been lost, it has simply become unprofitable. In a world of fast food and disposable tableware, there is no place for swords that take months to forge. However, interest in ancient technologies is reviving. Enthusiasts, reenactors, and blacksmiths are once again firing up their forges and picking up their hammers, trying to restore metal to its former glory. They are proving that the old methods are alive and well. Perhaps someday we will find a balance between modern knowledge of chemistry and ancient principles of quality. We will create materials that are affordable yet durable. But until that happens, we can only admire the skill of our ancestors, who, without microscopes or spectrometers, created things that outlived empires. And remember that the best protection against rust is not chemistry, but human hands that cherish and love their work. The history of medieval iron is a lesson for all of us. It is a story of how limitations give rise to perfection and scarcity breeds respect. Ancient craftsmen did not fight nature, but cooperated with it, turning the disadvantages of ore into the advantages of alloy. They showed us that dirty and primitive can be more reliable than clean and high-tech. That the secret of durability lies not only in the formula of steel, but also in its structure, processing, and, most importantly, in the attitude of the person toward the object. Today, when you look at a rusting car wing, remember the sword in the museum. Remember that progress does not always move in a straight line upwards. Sometimes we turn towards convenience, losing eternity along the way. What technologies of the past do you think we should bring back into modern life, despite their high cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new investigations into the mysteries of history.